Children's Church. And for the rest of us, this is our final week in the book of Isaiah. And staying true to its character, this book doesn't fizzle out toward the end. In fact, it goes big as you can get and still be in creation. This morning, our passage takes us to a cosmic scope, where twice in the last 2 chapters of Isaiah, we hear God declare, "Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth." God is up to something big. But just how big? Well, in chapter 65, we find out that Jerusalem will be restored and it will become a place of joy. But what God is doing for Jerusalem is not just about Jerusalem. It is about the heavens and the earth. And so what God is doing for Jerusalem will ripple out, and all of creation will experience the effects of what God has done for Jerusalem. And this is described in these ways. Weeping and distress will be eliminated. Verse 20 says it this way: "No more shall there be an infant who lives but a few days." No one will ever again be taken too soon. People will live secure in their homes. They will do good work with their hands. They will eat their fill. There will be peace on the earth among God's creatures. Chapter 66 then goes on to tell us that part of what will happen is that God is going to gather all nations and all languages so that all people can see God's glory. And to do this, he's going to send his people out to every place where people have yet to hear of God's fame or see his glory. There, God's servants will declare his glory, and all flesh will come to worship this God. Man, that's huge. Why would Isaiah end this way? Many have said that Isaiah is a book that is so specific, so narrow, dealing with specific historical instances with people in a particular place in a particular time, to then come to the end and sort of blow up with this huge scope. Well, think about your normal concerns, the things that consume your daily thought life on a daily basis. Things like making sure that there is enough food on the table, paying bills, family and friends, our yards, our travels, the things that need to get done around the house, making sure that our kids have the opportunities we want them to have, planning for retirement. We have no problem writing these sorts of lists, right? Because whatever is on your individual list, these are the things that you are thinking about all the time. And so you could easily write this list out. How many of us at different points have sat around, maybe together, maybe it's at our small group, maybe it's at one of our board meetings, maybe it's just over dinner or just one-on-one, and sort of lamented about how difficult it can be to take our eyes off of our concerns, our issues, ourselves. Whereas even those moments where we do sort of lift our eyes up and we see our church or we see our neighborhood or we see our state or our nation or the world, don't we often tend to see these bigger communities still in terms of our own interests? Like, we look at the world and we wonder, is the world safe? Are we safe from terrorism, from outside threats? Maybe we wonder what kind of world there will even be for our children. We look at our nation and we wonder whether our interests are being protected. We look at our neighborhoods and our schools and we wonder if others are doing enough for our kids, teaching them at the right pace, providing them the right opportunities. And then we look at our church and we wonder whether it's feeding us or serving us or giving us what we want or need. There's this human tendency to think of ourselves and our own interests. Even in those moments where we think about others or think about bigger groups, we can still be completely consumed with ourselves. There were at least 5 different things that I put on my to-do list last week. All 5 being specifically for others outside of sort of the scope of my work. There was someone I thought could use a visit. There were 2 more people that I thought would appreciate someone reaching out to them. There was someone else that I was going to write a letter to, and there was one other person that I thought about getting a gift for. Not one of these things got checked off of my to-do list this week. Why? Because I was consumed with myself and my own stuff and my work and my family. It is to a self-consumed people that God announces, "Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth." He makes this announcement in order to draw them out of themselves and to draw them into what God is doing. Let me set the story here. In the final pages of Isaiah, things have changed quite dramatically for these people that we have traced through this giant book. They've been released from exile. Babylon, the people who sent them into exile, took them into exile, have been utterly destroyed. And so the focus of this story shifts big time, because we're no longer listening in on a people who are living as exiles in a foreign land. But these exiles have come back. They've come back to the land that God promised to them so many hundreds of years ago. But this journey home has not been the journey that they expected or hoped it would be. Have you ever come home? Have you ever come back to something or some place that has changed dramatically over a period of time, and it's not quite as you remember it? You might connect with this experience. Those who have come back find themselves in perilous conditions. Their leaders have seized the opportunity to grasp hold of everything that they can get their hands on. They're described in these final chapters as blind, lacking knowledge, lacking understanding. They have an appetite that's voracious, and each of them are out for their own gain. And as a result of this, ordinary workers are oppressed. The people are fighting amongst themselves. Anyone who owns land or has employees have enslaved their brothers and their sisters and are working them under harsh conditions for little pay. Hunger is widespread throughout the land. Homelessness is epidemic. People hardly have enough to clothe themselves. Evil is spoken anywhere. This could not be more opposite from God's promise of what is to be made new. In fact, it couldn't be more opposite from God's original promise that this would be a land of bounty and flourishing. So how did things get so bad? God's people have been set free from their physical slavery, but they remain enslaved to their sin, to their selfishness, to their overwhelming orientation to themselves. It's like the person who thinks that they will escape all of their problems with a change of circumstances by just moving away. So they move only to discover that they brought themselves with them. So how does God's announcement that he's creating new heavens and new earth fit into this story? Well, when God announces he's creating a new heavens and a new earth, he's actually answering their prayers. And so chapter 63, we read their prayers. Chapter 63, verse 15, we hear them begin to call out, "Look down from heaven and see. From your holy and beautiful habitation, where is your zeal and your might? The stirring of your inner parts and your compassion are held back from me." Can you hear the questioning, the complaint in their prayer? Can you see the finger wagging at God? How did things get so bad? It's you, God. Look down and see what's happening. Do you even care? Have you even noticed what we're going through down here? Look and see. It gets even better, and we keep reading in verse 17. "Oh Lord, why do you make us wander from your ways and harden our hearts so that we fear you not?" This is awesome. Just about every chapter leading up to this point has highlighted some part of God's character, has highlighted some action, something that God has done on behalf of these stubborn people. In chapters 40 through 55, he made it clear that he wanted to deal with both their physical slavery and their spiritual wickedness. But clinging to their wickedness, they've now turned against God. He is the one to blame. If they have sinned, it's because God has made them sin. It's because God has remained distant. He has abandoned them. In verse 17, "Return for the sake of your servants," they cry out. In verse 18, "Our adversaries have trampled down your sanctuary," they cry again. Here's the crux of their complaint against God. They've come back to the land. They have reclaimed the holy city of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem no longer has a temple, which means there is no longer a dwelling place for God in their midst, which means that God must not be here. He must be absent. Or is he? And this may need a bit of explanation, but if you can go back in Israel's story to the time when they were in the wilderness, when they had been released from Egypt in the book of Exodus, God showed himself in visible ways to make clear that he was present with his people. Originally, it was in a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. But then God gave them a tent, and he hovered over the holy place in the form of a cloud, and wherever the tent went, so did the cloud of God. And years later, they're in the land, and King Solomon builds a permanent temple to replace this tent, and the glory of God set itself up in visible ways so that no matter where you were coming from, you would see that God was dwelling in this holy city, in this holy temple. When that temple was later destroyed and the Israelites were taken away to Babylon, they came to believe that God and his presence were gone from Israel, were gone from them. And so here they are now. They're back in the land without a temple, without any sign that God is with them, except, of course, that they are still alive and have returned to the land. But their conclusion is that the reason why things continue to be bad is because God has forsaken them. This is God's fault. And so they continue to pray. And we keep reading in chapter 64, verse 1. This prayer just continues. This is one of those places where the chapter divisions are slightly unhelpful. But, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence." The people have just one request. One. It's no big deal. They just want God to come back, set up his home among them once again, and, tear open the heavens in order to make for this grand entry. No big deal. It's hard to say exactly what it would look like for the heavens to be ripped apart. In Genesis, God floods the earth by opening the windows of the heavens. These people aren't interested in opening windows. They want God to kick down the door. They don't want surprises. They don't want mystery. They want something earth-shaking, heaven-splitting, so that they know that God has returned and is in their midst, because that is when, then, they can be the people that God has asked them to be. When he has made himself known to them. I want to pause there because I think that there is an important connection between the expectations of these Israelites who have returned to the land and who expect God to show up in very particular ways, and the expectations that we often have of God. So far through Isaiah, if God has attempted to communicate anything, it is that he is with his people. Early in the book, you might remember that God tells Isaiah to name a kid, and to name that kid, God is with us. So that every time they saw that kid run through the sanctuary, every time that kid had a poopy diaper, every time that kid did anything, and they're like, oh yeah, God is with us, they might remember that God is with them. Then time and again, this is the same word that God speaks through his prophet to the people. God is with us. Do not forget that. So that whether God rescues the people in the face of destruction at the hands of the Assyrians or allows the Babylonians to destroy them, God is still with them. And so that whether you are now in the land or in exile, God again sends word that he is with them. And that since returning, he wants them to understand that he is the one who brought them back, that he has been with them, and that he is still with them. And yet, because God is not with them in the way that he was with them in the past, they struggle to believe it. They are living for a past experience of God's presence. And they're blaming their present unfaithfulness on God's refusal to be present with them as he was in the past. They're living for a past experience of God's presence. And they are blaming their present unfaithfulness on God's refusal to be present with them in the ways that he was in the past. In light of that, I want to make a series of confessions. When I became a Christian, I got connected to this church. And a guy named Eric, who many of you know, was the pastor on staff responsible for leading us in worship. And for years, Eric represented to me God's presence in worship. The quality of music, his introductions to the songs we would sing, his biblical, his personal reflections, his overall leadership provided this unique and moving experience. And then when I would go from here and participate in other Christian events, I would compare them to this church, and they would often fail to live up to what I had come to expect. And so in these other settings, I would struggle to participate, to get into it, because I didn't feel the way there that I did here. I learned at that time a special kind of language that some used to describe this feeling, the Spirit. I began to hear people talking about the Spirit, the Holy Spirit being in worship with us. If the worship service moved me, what I was feeling was the Holy Spirit. If the service was lifeless or disengaging, then the Spirit hadn't joined us. We had squelched somehow the Spirit and prevented the Spirit from coming. This all began to come to a head for me after Eric left. He hadn't been here very long when I started on staff. And another worship leader came in, and I was quickly confronted with my ideas about God's Spirit and God's presence in the church's gatherings of worship. And so here's how that played out. This new worship leader was constantly frustrated. He felt like he couldn't get people to participate in the singing, at least not the way that he expected. And so every time we would meet and we would pray together before service, he would say, let's pray that the Holy Spirit would come today, that people would worship God to bring the Holy Spirit. So here's my first confession in all of this. I had a pretty bad attitude about this guy. He wasn't Eric, and more than that, I just didn't like him very much as a worship leader. I don't know if I'm actually allowed to say that out loud, but I didn't. And my attitude was reflected in my desire or lack of desire to then participate in worship. I would see him on the platform and I would just shut my eyes. Sometimes I wouldn't sing. Sometimes I would just pray that God would change him. I believed that the Spirit wasn't in our worship the way it had been in the past because of this guy. I was convinced that his leadership over worship was squelching the Spirit. There was at least one more person who would pray with us on Sunday mornings, and he would pray slightly differently, something like, Lord, come into this place. Pour your Spirit on us. Come so that we can worship you with joy and abandon. I don't know if you can hear the distinction in each of these attitudes, but the worship leader blamed the congregation. for God's Spirit not being present. I blamed the worship leader for God's Spirit not being present. And this third guy blamed God for not being present. And in our blame, each one of us denied a central promise that Jesus made to his disciples. When Jesus declared that he would be with them until the end of the age, he was making something abundantly clear, that no matter what, no matter if a congregation had lost its first love, God is still there. If every person in a congregation were to be put to death, God is still there. That if a congregation is overwhelmed with sin and idolatry, if a congregation has compromised to false teaching, if a congregation is lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, God is still there. That no matter what happens in a congregation, around a congregation, in the world, God has promised to be with his people. It took me an embarrassing number of years to realize that the presence of God's Spirit was not dependent on what we did or didn't do when we gathered for worship, or what we felt or didn't feel when we gathered for worship. Since I'm in a confessing mood today, after that worship leader left, I pushed to get Eric to come back. A year or so later, when we started worship service on Saturday nights, the first person I asked to come lead worship for us was Eric. I was desperate to recreate the past. And in all of my attempts to recreate past experiences, I missed the opportunity to be present to the God who was already there, who wanted to meet me on this new day on his terms. I was making excuses on a regular basis for not worshiping God, while God himself was busy all around me, drawing people to himself, showing them his love, calling them, transforming them. In fact, these things weren't just happening around me, they were happening in me. This season of my faith is such a crazy time, because when I look back on it, I was so busy trying to get God to show up that he was much closer than I actually realized all along, busy at work in me. God was teaching me to trust his word and to rest in his promises. He was reminding me how deeply he loves me. He was cultivating in me a new kind of relationship with him, one that was no longer dependent on signs and wonders, feelings and emotions, a relationship where God's word and God's Spirit are enough. We sing that, right? That's how we open service today. God's grace is enough for us. None of us is deserving of God's grace. That grace that comes through his word to guide us, that grace that comes through his son to save us, that grace that comes through his Spirit to transform us. We have all that we need to know God, to seek God, to grow in Christ's likeness, and to serve God. You know, it's interesting. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that at the same time that I stopped trying to manufacture experiences with God in worship, I also started to notice some of the Bible's broader social implications. The Spirit began to stir in me a curiosity about the kingdom of God. It was that year, actually, that our Mexico mission trip was themed around the kingdom. Heaven on earth was the theme of that year's trip. If you were to ask Matt, he may remember the timing, but this is when I began to talk a lot about, I was trying to process the kingdom of God and what it means to be citizens in this kingdom. And I began to catch glimpses of God's bigger work in the world. When God says to these former exiles, "Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth," he's saying, don't worry, I am with you. I am restoring you. And in the midst of all of your concerns, I'm at work. But my restoration project is way bigger than you. And so will you join me in this project? But there's a compromise here. God will use his servants in this recreation project, but they're going to have to stop trying to capture him in temples. In chapter 66, we heard Matt read this morning, "Thus says the Lord," verse 1, Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What is the house that you would build for me? And what is the place of my rest? All these things my hand has made, and so all these things came to be, declares the Lord. In other words, neither the heavens nor the earth can contain more than God's feet and his butt. If you don't like thinking about God's butt, tell him to stop sitting on the heavens, right? Pretty straightforward here. Stop trying to play with God as though he were a doll that could make his way in some house that you have created for him. God won't fit into tents and he won't fit into temples. God won't fit into our neat, tidy experiences. God won't be reduced to a formula or a feeling. God is recreating the heavens and the earth. This is the guy that we're going to try to get under our control. And so, what if, rather than control God, we gave our lives over to his purposes and his plans? What if we allowed God to reorient, to redirect the things that consume our everyday thoughts, getting us out of the center and putting God's new creation in it? See, because when God begins or is trying to transform their lives and their imaginations, they still have all the same issues. They still have lives to live, work to do, homes to build, mouths to feed. But it's that their imaginations go beyond themselves and their own circumstances. If we look back at the list of the normal things that consume our thought lives, that list I said that all of us could probably make pretty easily, we can see how God might repurpose or redirect our thinking in many of these things from ourselves to the interests of others. What do you have more than enough of? Across this room, that is going to be a different answer for all of us. Is it food? Is it clothes? Is it rooms? Is it garage space? Is it love? Time? Money? And the question becomes, who can you share that with as you think about what you have more than enough of? Does anyone around you have a bill that you could help pay? Does anyone around you have debt that you could help pay off, setting them free? Is there anyone in your neighborhood who lives alone? Is there a senior that could use some daily company? Is there a kid who comes home to an empty house after school? Is there a young couple who are living far from family? Each of these who could possibly become part of your family in some extended way. Could you adopt or be a foster parent? Who might be blessed by an invitation into your home? What would it look like to provide someone a home? Are there things that fill up your life and your schedule that, if you're honest about it, just don't really matter that much? In the scope of your lives, maybe they need to be less of a priority. What are the things that could be minimized so that you have more time to love your neighbors well? Is there someone that you need to share your faith with? Is there someone that you need to forgive? Is there someone you need to be reconciled with? Is there something that you think is important for your kids or your grandkids? A sport, an opportunity, an experience, something that you think that your kid or your grandkid needs to grow as a healthy and whole person? Is there another kid next door, down the street, that you at school, or a teenager nearby who can't afford those same opportunities or experiences that you could then help with? Is there a local nonprofit that you could give time to? Do you have skills or gifts or abilities or resources that would bless your church family if you made them available? As you notice, I just listed a ridiculous number of things, of possibilities, not because I expect any of you to do all of them or any of them. They might be bad ideas for you. This list was an attempt to summarize just some of the many things that I have heard you doing, the things that the Spirit has been prompting you to do, the ways in which you have been responding in faithfulness this week, this year, in recent years. These are the kinds of things, the acts of love, the mercy, compassion, and justice that God uses to create new. It's this kind of life, caught up in God's new creation, that will attract the nations. It's in our love, which is really God's love, that the world will see God's glory. And so, as Isaiah comes to an end, we've been given an invitation. Will we obsess over the things that we think God hasn't done for us, or that God should do for us? Or will we get caught up in what God is doing, not only for us, but for the whole world? And so today is our day to declare God's glory among the nations. Will we declare it with our mouths? Will we declare it with our lives? Amen.